Recently, Gwynne Shotwell updated the SpaceX timeline for going to Mars, and I'm pretty grateful to her for doing so because, after all, it was pretty unrealistic what Elon Musk had said a number of years ago that we would be arriving on Mars in some sort of unmanned form by 2024 and a manned mission by 2026. This is seeming more and more impossible with every passing day. However, if Starship is indeed ready to take human beings to the lunar surface by 2025, that means we're going to have a human-rated Starship by 2025, and also a Starship that's capable of a hell of a lot of low Earth orbit refueling, which means going to Mars seems to be a lot more feasible. But should we be going to Mars? Why is this such an urgent thing? I mean, NASA isn't planning to go there until 2040, and that's probably not going to happen exactly on their timetable either. So why is 2030 so important to SpaceX? Why must we become a multiplanetary species so quickly? Well, over the course of the next 3 episodes, we're going to explore all of the details of going to Mars, colonizing Mars, and indeed why we should do this in the first place. I mean, why do we need to leave our own system so quickly? And also, why does it have to be Mars? Why not just the moon? Or why not maybe the atmosphere of Venus? Both of these locations are actually closer than Mars, and Venus has a gravity that's more similar to ours. Although many people agree that we should explore Mars at some point in the near future, colonizing Mars represents all kinds of unique challenges. This is a planet where we can't breathe, a planet that we will never see another ocean on, a planet where we won't see a naturally growing tree. So many things that colonists will have to endure if they make the journey here. Why should they have to do it? Why must our species become multiplanetary? There are many reasons why Mars failed as a planet. For one thing, obviously, the magnetic field. Although Mars has a much more active geology than we once thought, its core does not generate a magnetic field the way ours does. Therefore, it was subjected to all the destructive effects of cosmic rays and solar radiation that gradually stripped away its atmosphere. And that process continues, even though its atmosphere is still there and still represents a useful resource for future colonists. It's not something that is ever going to be breathable for a very, very long period of time, if ever. There are many raging arguments as to whether or not terraforming is even a possible or plausible sort of thing without spending millions of years doing it. So future Martian colonists for many centuries, if not millennia, are going to have to face an environment that's incredibly hostile to humans, a place where we can't breathe, a place where the radiation is substantially higher, a place where the pressure is so low that if you go outside without an environmental suit, your blood is going to boil. This doesn't sound like a very good place to live. It sounds like one of the worst places imaginable to live, and yet this is where Elon Musk wants to establish the human species first and start our multiplanetary journey on this very hostile world, a world where the gravity is so low that if somebody stays here for too long, they most probably will never be able to return to Earth. Now, the gravity issue is something I'm going to deal with in the next episode, so what I really want to focus on here is why the hell does the human species need to go to this place, this blighted, lifeless world that may have some bacterial life of some kind. As a matter of fact, I find that to be very likely, but on the other side of the spectrum is just incredibly hostile to us and not a pleasant place to live at all compared to our own planet. Well, here's the major reason. Although Elon Musk talks about things like asteroid impacts and the sun eventually expanding and becoming more hostile to where our planet will eventually become an uninhabitable place, those possibilities are so remote and so far out in the future that people are unlikely to take it very seriously, especially governments. What Elon should be focusing on, and he does from time to time, is the fact that there are many other ways that our civilization could either be dealt a death blow or a cataclysm so serious that our future survival would be very much in doubt. And the first of these potential cataclysms is something that everybody talks about: climate change and global warming. Although it doesn't seem likely that climate change is going to represent a serious enough threat to extinguish our species, it could change things on this planet so radically to where eventually our species begins fighting each other for quickly vanishing resources. And of course, this kind of fighting could go nuclear at some point. But really, does climate change represent this kind of threat? Well, some people think so. Here's a map of what the Earth may look like in less than a century if we keep going the way we are. As you can see, the vast majority of the Earth's surface is now uninhabitable, and the remaining surface has to be reserved for the 8 billion or more inhabitants that are likely to be left over. This is frankly an untenable situation. There is no effective way to evacuate billions and billions of people to such a restrictive area on the Earth's surface. And frankly, it's just going to get worse if things continue to spiral out of control with a runaway greenhouse effect. The habitable areas of the planet will continue to shrink and shrink, even if our pollutive and destructive activities cease completely. There is theoretically a point where the greenhouse effect will continue to rage out of control until the entire Earth's surface is simply no longer friendly to human habitation, and there is likely to be a great deal of violence on a massive scale as humans desperately try to take advantage of what resources and what livable area may remain. This is not a very pleasant future, and even though it could be argued that living on Mars would be a lot more difficult than living on a world that even was this destroyed by climate change, Martian colonists wouldn't have to contend with millions of desperate refugees who are willing to do anything they could to take whatever remained of the Earth for themselves and to hell with everybody else. Instead, Martian colonists would probably remain united in the face of such a disaster on the home world and do everything they could to survive, and perhaps even to deliver some sort of emergency supplies back to Earth to try to make life more livable. Now, do I think this is likely that climate change is going to be this bad? Well, no, I actually don't. However, there is a very potent example of a runaway greenhouse effect in our own solar system, and this is Venus. Venus is a perfect example of what happens when you have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we have the unique problem of having lots and lots of methane trapped in the permafrost that's slowly being released as the temperature warms, and methane is 10 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. Who knows what's going to happen if all the methane in the permafrost is released? Is it going to create a runaway greenhouse effect the likes of what Venus has? It's hard to say for certain, and I would prefer not to take the chance. Now, a second cataclysm that is definitely going to happen not in the next several billion years, but perhaps in the next several thousand years, or perhaps even in the next several thousand days, is something called a supervolcano. All of us have heard of these things probably. Volcanoes that have calderas that are tens of kilometers wide, such as the one in Yellowstone that erupted several 100,000 years ago. Now, naturally, these things don't happen very often. However, there are some volcanologists who argue that Yellowstone is long overdue for another eruption, and this would be an eruption unlike anything the human species has ever experienced in the past. An eruption that would create a superheated pyroclastic flow that would spread out for hundreds of kilometers from the central point of the explosion, and on top of that, it would rain superheated ash for hundreds of kilometers further out from the point of the explosion. As a matter of fact, if you were close enough to even witness the explosion, even on the distant horizon, you would most probably be dead a few minutes or maybe an hour or two afterwards as superheated ash rained down on your head, up to a meter of it for hundreds of kilometers outside the area of the eruption. That's something unlike anything our species has ever confronted, and it's something that is definitely going to happen sometime in the future. If a supervolcano were to erupt at Yellowstone today, virtually the entire western half of the North American continent would be blighted and rendered uninhabitable, buried under decimeters, if not meters, of volcanic ash. And to make matters worse, many billions of tons of debris would be thrown into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun. And we're going to talk about the worldwide consequences of that kind of event a little later on when we talk about nuclear winter. But here's the reality. At some point, this is going to happen. Do we really want our civilization to be facing this sort of cataclysm alone and only on one planet when another alternative exists? And then there's the sun, the source of all life on Earth, and also something that could theoretically deal our civilization a massive blow from which we might not be able to recover. Coronal mass ejections happen all the time. As a matter of fact, our own planet was hit by one about a century ago, and it knocked out virtually every electrical system in the world. However, at the time, very little of the Earth's population was dependent on electricity. These days, it has been said, the facade of human civilization only exists as long as there is electricity. And although we've been conducting some drills lately to prepare for the possibility of a coronal mass ejection hitting our planet, we are very ill prepared for this sort of event. And these sorts of events can only take a few hours to reach our planet, and if they were to hit us, an extremely powerful one, it could potentially knock out our entire electrical infrastructure for almost a year. And during that time, especially without food production on a massive scale, which is something that our population very much depends on, you would have starvation, the likes of which has never been seen on this planet, at least as long as human beings have been around. This is something that could create violence on a planetary scale, violence between nations, because their hardened military systems, ironically enough, would survive an event like this, just not everything else, which could create a huge amount of chaos and violence that could threaten to bring our civilization down once again if things go nuclear. And then, of course, as Elon Musk likes to point out, somewhere in the solar system, or perhaps beyond the solar system, there's an asteroid or a comet with our name on it. And even though NASA has been doing a great deal of work to make sure that planet-killing asteroids, such as the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, are not in any sort of imminent danger of crashing into our planet, and we don't seem to have any imminent threats anytime, at least in in the next century, that doesn't mean that some Kuiper Belt object isn't going to come sailing into the inner solar system, or perhaps from an interstellar location, and collide with Earth. This is something that will eventually happen, regardless of how long it takes. One day it is going to happen, and when it does happen, the effects are going to be nothing less than world-shattering, something that could definitely end our civilization just as surely as a nuclear war could. An asteroid or comet the size of Chicxulub would create an explosion the force of several billion Hiroshima bombs. It would also create tsunamis at least 150 meters high that would wipe out communities hundreds of kilometers away from the coastline. And to make matters even worse, it would eject superheated material, billions of tons worth, into the upper atmosphere that would then re-enter, heating the atmosphere to a point that's difficult to comprehend. We're talking about hundreds of degrees Celsius almost worldwide. There would be some areas that wouldn't be impacted by this hellish day, but the vast majority of the planet would. Anything made out of wood, from forests to houses, would spontaneously burst into flame, and a massive worldwide inferno would wipe out the vast majority of anything living on the surface of the planet, including the vast majority of the human race. This is something that's difficult to understand. It sounds like science fiction. It sounds impossible, but it's happened before, and it will happen again at some point. Very unlikely that it's going to happen in the next several million years, but still, it will happen eventually, and it's something that we should be prepared for. And many of the cataclysms that I've been talking about all have the same long-term consequence in common. From supervolcanoes to asteroid impacts, all of them have the potential to generate their own version of a nuclear winter. And nuclear war, at least at present, is the most likely cataclysm that our civilization could face, given the current circumstances in Ukraine and all the potential for escalation. The possibility, the nightmare possibility of Russia and the United States utilizing its roughly 3,000 combined nuclear weapons that are ready for action right now. They actually have arsenals that are over 10,000 warheads in size. If you combine the two countries, it is possible that they could unleash these arsenals on each other sometime in the near future. And the consequences of this would be difficult to predict, difficult to understand really, because nuclear winter is unique compared to supervolcanoes or even asteroid impacts. The key are things like burning cities. Even asphalt can burn at the temperatures that these nuclear bombs get to, according to Joshua Koop, who's an atmospheric science doctoral candidate at Rutgers University. He says that the worldwide urban fires that would be created by a full-fledged nuclear exchange would burn everything in sight, creating, quote, a very dirty, sooty smoke. And what's important about black carbon, which is created by this smoke, is that it absorbs radiation very, very efficiently, according to Koop. The air surrounding it becomes very buoyant, and it's able to lift the soot into the stratosphere. The reason that's important is the higher the soot goes, the longer it stays in the atmosphere, and the longer it blocks solar radiation. Quote, volcanoes produce sulfate aerosols that don't absorb much radiation. Because they don't absorb as much, their lifetime is somewhere between 1 and 2 years. Comparatively speaking, their research shows that nuclear-produced soot would last for up to a decade. I can't begin to comprehend what 2,000 or 3,000 nuclear explosions would do to our civilization. I mean, even if you discount all the burning cities and all the nuclear fallout, the winter alone would be a cataclysm unlike anything our species has ever faced. And yes, we are very fortunate, by the way, that our civilization has never had to deal with something like this, because a nuclear winter would be completely civilization ending. We're talking about a 10-degree reduction in global mean surface temperature, which means a 90% reduction in the growing season across most of the planet, and extreme changes in precipitation, obviously. And to put this into perspective, the temperature change that we're so worried about with global warming is only 1 degree Celsius over the course of an entire century, but in nuclear winter, it does 10 times that within 2 or 3 years. Carl Sagan often talked about the horrific threat of nuclear war and was actually one of the people who originally conceived the idea of nuclear winter. This is probably the worst cataclysm that our civilization could face, simply because there would be billions of people across the planet who had no vested interest whatsoever in the conflict between the United States and the Russians who would suffer as a result. We're talking about a 10-year winter and a famine that would probably kill far more people than the war itself actually would. This is just one of a number of cataclysms that could strike our planet, one of several different things that could put the future of our species in jeopardy. And the only way that we can protect ourselves is to move our civilization and our species to a self-sustaining colony someplace else. Mars is an ideal spot simply because it is far enough away to not be effectively targeted in the middle of a major conflict. Venus is another possibility, but it doesn't have much in the way of water, even in its upper atmosphere. Yes, it has a number of advantages, but really Mars is a better option simply because it has billions of tons of water ice, which would be very important to our future survival. Will living on Mars be an easy thing, a fun thing, or an exciting thing? Well, it may be exciting, but it's not going to be easy or fun. But in my opinion, it's absolutely vital to the survival of our species. Still, there's lots of people who argue that the difficulty of establishing a Martian colony is just so tough. It would be so difficult to do this on such a hostile planet that it simply isn't practical. And I'll be talking about those particular issues in my next episode called Mars Misconceptions. So until the world realizes that becoming a multiplanetary civilization is the only way that we can ensure the long-term survival of the species, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.